So, Chapter 13, Section 4. We're going to discuss the West African civilizations, analyze Ibn Battuta's journeys, and examine West African culture. None of the West African civilizations developed a written language. They would do what's called oral history, a spoken record of past events. Now, this is how history traditionally was originally done. We talked about at the beginning of the school year that the prehistoric period is before there was writing. That's when the oral history period existed. That's where people said they didn't write things down, but they said, when we do it today, your great great grandfather killed a lot of animals in this area, and so this is the reason why we stay in this area because it's where we hunt at or whatever. That's the idea is that oral history is what you talk about. Like for example, I'll tell a lot of times, to my wife or kids or whoever, hey, yeah, my grandpa, he did this. That's oral history. That's me talking about it. I ain't writing it down. I'm not keeping a record of it, even though I probably should. It's just a spoken record of past events, and we do this all the time. Whenever you reminisce about, hey, remember in fourth grade when so-and-so did this? That's an oral history. That's you remember what happened in the past. And for civilizations that don't have a written language, oral history is all they have to go on. And this was done by the griots, which were the storytellers of early West Africa. And there's a good video that I got on Google Classroom called The Griot Tradition of West Africa. And that it's a good video because it shows you a little bit of how the griots were. And the fact that they're more than just storytellers. They were the keepers of history. They were the keepers of their culture, their customs, all these different things. Because they were the ones that knew everything that had happened because they passed it down. And this is just an advertisement for the Singing Man adapted from West African folklore, which is about West African griots. The griot stories were both entertaining and informative. Sometimes they talk in proverbs, which are short sayings of wisdom or truth. And if you remember back from what we talked about in, I believe, chapter 7, Jewish history, we talked about the Jewish people have a book of proverbs, which was written by King Solomon for the most part. It's just short sayings of wisdom and truth, and the same is true here. The griots have passed on the history of West Africa from generation to generation. They would pass it on to the next generation, who would pass it on to the next. Some of the West African epics are long poems about kingdoms and heroes. The Dossi tells the history of Ghana, and the Sundiata is about Mali's great ruler. And so a lot of times they'll pass these things down and it becomes stories, epics, poems, things like that. In addition to the oral stories passed down to the people of West Africa, we also have accounts of visitors that visited West Africa. The most noted is Ibn Battuta, who is the most famous Muslim visitor to write about Western Africa, and he describes in great detail about the political and cultural lives of West Africans. And so the idea is that the only accounts we have of the history of Western Africa is the things that have been passed down in oral stories and the writings of people such as Ibn Battuta. And even though that the people didn't have a written language, Ibn Battuta did. And so he could record the things that he saw when he came. He saw the political and cultural structure. And again, there's a video called Ibn Battuta, the Greatest Explorer of All Time, that you need to watch on Google Classroom. Of all art forms of West Africa, the sculpture is probably the most well known. Many of these sculptures are people, usually the ancestors of the sculptor. And because the sculptures were usually used in religious ceremonies, many African artists were deeply respected. They were seen basically as making sacred items that were used in religious ceremonies. And so they were kind of religious figures in a way. And so they were very respected because of their role they played in religious ceremonies. They'd also carve elaborate masks. People would use the mask in rituals and would wear them as they'd enter on a fire. They would use them, a lot of times they'd represent animals or spirits or things like that. You have a kente, which is a hand-woven, brightly covered fabric, and I've got a video called The Beautiful Art of the Kente that's on Google Classroom that you can watch about that. But it's just a hand-woven fabric. It's not done by machines. It's hand-woven, and they use a lot of different colors. This is some examples of kentes. In many West African societies, music and dance were important in the visual arts. Dance has long been a central part of African society, and in some African cultures, people still perform dances that were performed hundreds of years ago. And again, and I keep saying this, but it's important you look on Google Classroom and some of these videos I share because it gives you more information. It's kind of like if you're in class and I'm teaching it, I'll show videos to kind of apply to some of the stuff. There's a video called West African Dance Company. It's a modern video that shows you some of the culture of the West African dance and a little bit about how those look and how they dress and stuff like that. And dance is a very important part of African culture even today. So that brings us to the end of this chapter. So we will pick back up with chapter 14, which is the second chapter on the history of China. So that's all for chapter 13.